So we're delighted to have Ms. Gibbons Edgar, who has agreed to talk about her experience as a social worker in South Carolina. So, Ms. Gibbons Edgar, or Neela,
Neela,
as
please.
you've allowed me to let me start by asking you to share your thoughts about why social workers need to know something about history, culture, and the shared experience of South Carolinians.
I think the key word as to why it's important to understand the culture and history of South Carolina, or in fact any place where you're practicing social work, is context. We're all shaped by the environments in which we were raised, in which we live, by the experiences we have had in our life. And as social workers, the key to our profession is communication. You can't communicate effectively if you don't understand where the person is, what their background is, their cultural interpretations, their colloquial expressions. In South Carolina particularly, we have to be very much aware of our legacy of class and race that have tremendous impact on all interactions in our state, but particularly on interactions with folks who are in need of social work services. Mill workers, who many people don't think much about, are the heart of our rural communities. Their reactions and responses of class and their reaction to affluent white South Carolinians is quite different from that of the African Americans, but yet there's some things that are very unique. There is a difference there. There are issues there that we've got to understand. And I've been around this state long enough to know that just sometimes somebody's accent can turn off the whole conversation, or somebody uses a colloquial expression that is not appropriate. I think especially in South Carolina, the proper use of professional and honorific titles is crucial. A lot of the white community will call each other by first name, as we're doing now very comfortably, and enjoy doing that. But the African American community, even in closer relationships, tend to use their honorific or professional titles such as Attorney Jones or Professor Morgan. And so I think you have to understand a community to know where those things are. If you go into a client and say, hey, I'm Neela, hi Betty, nice to meet you, you might have just insulted someone and they might feel like that you're looking down on them and are not recognizing them as a human being. So I think that the culture and history frame the people you're dealing with, they frame the way you interact, and you just can't come to South Carolina and say, well, let me tell you how we did it up there, because people here don't really give two hoots. The legacies that we've got to consider that affect all the experiences are the legacies of poverty, poor education, and racism. They undercut everything. Any decision that is made throughout the history of social welfare, nationally in South Carolina, has been predicated on the issues at that time related to politics, religion, and the economy. Those are the key factors, whether you're talking about the Elizabethan Poor Laws, scientific charity, the war on poverty, the war on welfare, the Great Depression. Those three factors interact to form policy. A lot of my career was on the policy level. I was responsible for state agencies, so while I was dealing with and understanding and seeing the human needs, I had to deal with policy. And to deal with policy, those were the factors I had to be aware of in influencing legislators and working with legislators. I think the fact that I grew up in a segregated South, that I spent summers in a rural agricultural community, that I lived through and saw firsthand the civil rights movement, gave me a knowledge of the depth and the core issues of racism and poverty in this state, which I think helped me have a better understanding, but it certainly never prepared me to fully understand the distinctions and the cultural issues that I would need to know better to address. I think one of the ones that I managed to manipulate, if that's the correct word, the best, was working with a predominantly white male legislature as a white female. I was one of the first females to head a state agency in South Carolina in a very male world. And I knew a lot of the legislators then were older gentlemen, and they would call me honey. They would expect me to kiss them on the cheek.
Mm-hmm.
They would say, sweetheart. Now, a pretty little head like you doesn't need to worry about that budget. How much money you want for them little raggedy-ass kids?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a direct quote from a budget presentation I made to a Senate Finance Subcommittee. So I quickly doubled my request and moved on. He said, now give me a little kiss on the cheek, righty, honey. We'll take care of them little kids. Now that can sound very pejorative to someone listening to this, but that was the reality in 1980 in the legislature. My job was to get funding for children in foster care. And if I had to play the game and give him a kiss on the cheek and be called honey, that was fine with me because it accomplished what I needed to. I couldn't have done that without an understanding of that culture. I would have been highly insulted.
Right.
If a legislator did that today, it would be a whole different story. This is probably on a broader scale, but I really wish I had understood more the unintended consequences of social policy. And I think AFDC is the prime example. It was started as a pension for widows and orphans after the war, because then women didn't work. They had no income. They were in abject poverty if their husband had been killed in the war. Well, you couldn't be married. You had to be a widow and you had to have children. Immediately in the South, with our poverty, we had African American women who were struggling to make a living, African American men. It was suddenly very clear, if I have a baby, I can get, and no husband, I can get a check. Mm-hmm. Without realizing it, we created a multi-generational grouping of single women-headed families. And I think did a lot of damage to what had been a very strong family culture in the African American community. I really do think AFDC, and this is my personal opinion, I don't have a lot of research to back it up, but I really do think AFDC was a well-intended policy that had horrendous unintended consequences. And I think that's true of almost every policy we pass, and I think as social workers we have to be so attuned to that when we're lobbying for policies or looking at things. We always need to be looking down the road and say, what might the unintended consequences of this be? Mm-hmm. You know, now it's TANF, you can be married. Yes. The work requirement has been beneficial. There's talk now about eliminating it. Mm-hmm. We need to think about, is that good, is that bad? I would say learn the background of the community, of the individual. Mm-hmm. Listen before you do anything. Don't preach. Mm-hmm. And don't tell somebody how they ought to do it. Mm-hmm. I think we tend to, in the, quote, helping profession, want to impose our values and our beliefs on other people and say, well, if you just did this, you'd be okay. So I would say you need to come in and get to know the community, get to know the colloquial expressions, get to learn to understand, particularly if you're dealing in health areas, that people are going to have sugar. Mm-hmm. They're going to have expressions that you're not used to that mean something to them. And if you come in with language that they can't understand or that confuses them, it's not a positive way to approach it. So listen.
Thank you. And if you could take a social worker somewhere in this state, where would it be and why?
I think I'd take him to Allendale.
Interesting.
Allendale is your sadly typical, extremely impoverished rural community that at one time was very affluent. Poverty, unemployment is rampant in Allendale. Mm-hmm. You can go down Main Street and where there used to be a vibrant economy, there is nothing. The educational system has been one of the poorest in the state. It's been, it was put on probation by the State Department of Education quite a few years ago. They're struggling down there. So I think if you're going to understand South Carolina, you've got to understand the poverty, the lack of the poor education, and the life in the rural community, because most South Carolinians are either still in those rural communities trying to scrape out a living, or maybe they've moved to the bigger city where if they move with a poor education, they're probably still trying to scrape out a living. And that legacy is with them. So I would go to Allendale. The reason why I think it's so important to understand culture is if you look at health disparities in South Carolina and you look at how we address health screening and improving health care. I did not realize until I worked at DHEC in health policy the reaction of the African American male to certain preventive tests, particularly if they were performed by a white physician. And that was something that is cultural that would have never occurred to me had I not had the opportunity to work with the leaders in health disparities at DHEC. And I also learned through that experience the importance of communication through barbershops and beauty shops, something I was totally unaware of. So if you're going to design a communication program with a population, the message of this is you've got to understand where do they really communicate. And generally the cultural and historical issues play a key role in that. Obviously, I'm very committed to the practice of social work. I feel like we've come a long way, but I also feel like we're treading water, and it's not a lot different than it was when I started out 40 years ago. If you look at the statistics, you know, our data is deplorable on the quality of life for children and our health outcomes. But I think one of the reasons I ended up in the social work profession was an experience I had as an 8-year-old child. We were out in the country at a family home with my grandmother. My grandmother was an attorney who practiced pro bono and had done a lot of work in the local community getting title to property for African American families. I saw the Ku Klux Klan come to one of those families and burn a cross in their yard. I saw my grandmother and my father take shotguns and go stand on the porch with that family. My grandmother had also represented a couple of those guys in the Klan who were bootleggers, and she got them out of jail to help protect her property. When they saw her on the porch with the shotgun and the family, they left. But that was probably the most compelling personal experience in my life that helped me see and understand the tremendous issues of racism we have in this state and the need to have folks get involved and try to make good decisions that can make life better for the entire community.